Hey there, welcome. I'm Shawna, your counseling astrologer, and this is episode 3 of Astro Psyche, the podcast where we explore depth psychological astrology. In this episode, we'll be talking about Pluto and its role in multi-generational patterns in family systems. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot as far as the dynamics that get passed down in a family from one generation to the next. And I especially want to talk about differentiation, and I'll explain that term a little bit more, but a person's ability to act from their own autonomy and not be overly affected or controlled by others, and how this differentiation dynamic, we can see it passed down through the generations, and then we can also see its connection to Pluto as a symbol, as an astrological planetary archetypal symbol, and also Pluto in the birth chart and the connection that it has, where we see actual repeating dynamics from in the birth chart from one generation to the next. So just a reminder also that this podcast may feel therapeutic, but it is not therapy. So please keep that in mind. All right, so Pluto. Pluto in astrology is the planet that is a symbol of power, control, secrets, and it is also a symbol of healing, catharsis, deep intimacy. And when I say power, it is the full spectrum of power. So power that can be harnessed in a negative, problematic, or manipulative way. And it is also a symbol of power in a way that where we're talking about empowerment and autonomy and power over your own sense of self, feeling powerful, feeling strong, this sense of having control and autonomy over your life and the way that you move through the world. And I feel that these themes are strongly connected to the psychological concept of differentiation. Differentiation, when I'm using it, it's in the context of a term that's used very often in Bowen family systems therapy. Bowen is Bowen. And that's actually a core component of that particular method. The way that it's defined is essentially having a strong sense of self, having a strong sense of ego or ego strength. I'm going to read for you from a textbook where it's defined very specifically, and then I want to give my thoughts on that. So I'm going to be reading a definition from the book called Family Therapy, Concepts and Methods, written by Michael Nichols and Sean Davis. This is on page 71. So they say that differentiation of self is essentially ego strength. It is the capacity to think and reflect, to not respond automatically to emotional pressures. It's the ability to be flexible and act wisely, even in the face of anxiety. People who are undifferentiated are easily moved into emotionality. I think when they're saying this means problematic emotionality, where it causes you pain or challenge. They go on to say people who tend to be undifferentiated or have undifferentiated states, their lives are ruled by reactivity to those around them. In contrast, a differentiated person is able to balance thinking and feeling. They're capable of strong emotion and spontaneity, but also possess the self-restraint that comes with the ability to resist the pull of emotionality. So this becomes problematic when a person finds it difficult to maintain their own autonomy, especially around anxious issues, and I would even add around anxious people. Okay, so that's how the textbook defines it. And I want to, so as far as I can tell, this idea of differentiation really values analytical thinking. It values coming from a logical place, a rational place versus an emotional place. Now, I think that can be helpful, especially in some scenarios. And I want to acknowledge that this concept really doesn't value emotions as much as the rational thought. And I think we need both. So I think that it's important to know that we're talking about this in the context of when a person is so overcome by emotion or by the emotion of others that it negatively affects their life. That's when not being differentiated can be a problem, and when we want to cultivate more of a sense of differentiation. And I think that in a way we can also look at this not necessarily as being more rational, but rather as having such a strong sense of yourself, who you are, what you're like, how you feel, so that when someone else is around you that has a strong emotional reaction, that you can meet that, you can be around them when they're being, anxious or angry or whatever it is, and not take it personally. I think that this concept is so very important for people who identify as highly sensitive or empathic, because the nature of being a highly sensitive person is that it is very difficult to not take on the feelings of other people. And so this concept of differentiation is super important for people that are highly sensitive or empathic, and it is a muscle that you can build. And we'll talk about more about how to do that in a moment. But I just really want to emphasize that this differentiation, the way that I conceptualize it, is it's about being differentiated is when you can maintain your own sense of self when you're around highly volatile or highly emotional people and situations. Now, how does this connect to Pluto? So I think this connects to Pluto because at the core of this, Pluto is about power. It's about your not necessarily external power. Pluto is about internal power, and that libido, that energy, that life force, your ability to have a strength and an inner knowing. And along with that, I think where that power comes from is Pluto is also about shame and our ability to metabolize shame. So shame is where a person feels not just like they have done something bad or a bad thing has happened. Shame is where we feel an innate sense of wrongness or lacking that isn't about behavior or action. It's about the core of who you are. And as far as I can tell, shame is an essential part of the human experience. So we all experience shame at varying different levels and different points. And we have different ways of coping with that and dealing with that. And the more that we can metabolize shame, the more that we can process it and know that there is nothing inherently wrong with us, that we are loved, that we're okay. And the more that we can remind ourselves that and be around people who remind us of that and do help us to feel loved and accepted, that helps us metabolize and process and sort of like compost that shame. So Pluto is also associated with this process of transformation, of composting, of breaking something down so that it totally gets transformed into a new thing. And people that have a strong Pluto connection in their birth chart tend to really align with this kind of process. So that can be a person that has Pluto on their ascendant or on an important point or an aspect to a personal planet, or maybe several personal planets, especially maybe the moon or the sun or the inner planets. So people that have these kinds of aspects, they tend to be drawn into scenarios where there is a need to process and metabolize psychological phenomenon. Or they can also be drawn into high crisis scenarios where there's a potential for trauma. And again, trauma is something that trauma is essentially where we have an experience that we were not able to process or metabolize psychologically in the moment. And so I would also argue that our inability to metabolize shame, like when we feel shame so strongly that we can't process it, that actually leads to a psychological trauma or an insecure attachment, which leads to anxiety. And that makes it more difficult for us to be around other people that are upset and to not take that on personally. So, so I want to pause for a moment and ask you how this is landing for you. And if it makes sense or not. As always, I want you to take what resonates and what doesn't. And I wonder if you can contemplate how it is that you respond when other people around you are mad, controlling, anxious. Like how does that affect you? How do you respond when someone is essentially like emotionally not okay and they're having a moment? I think especially when it's people that we love or people that are very important to us, that are strong bonds, it can be like, of course, you're going to be affected by someone who's upset or anxious or mad. I think that is very natural, and our natural inclination is to try to help or to problem solve or to try to make someone, to comfort someone. I think so the distinction that I want to make here with how Pluto comes in and how differentiation comes in is that some people have a tendency to take those emotions personally. And maybe you have someone in your life who, when they have this anxiousness or this anger, or this controllingness, it may even be directed towards you personally, which of course makes it even more difficult. And I think that it's so important to try to cultivate this sense of differentiation, this sense of ego strength, to filter out what is someone else's and what is yours, and how it is that you can be okay and know that you're okay, and know that that person's feeling, that person's emotion is theirs. It's not yours. It's not personal, when they're in that moment. And this is essentially like, this could even be like holding space for people. But I think that a part of it also is, how do you manage holding space for people versus holding space for yourself? Yeah. And so how do you respond to this? And to bring this into the multi-generational situation, how do you see these patterns happening in your life? How do you see it, or how have you witnessed it or know about it, maybe happening in your families and the different generations? So maybe your parents or the people who raised you, their parents, if you have kids or siblings, how do things play out? How do the people in your family respond when someone is upset or there's a disagreement? And so these questions that I'm asking you, a lot of this is what we would call process questions. So this is more asking, and these are things that I want you to continue asking this how. So we're talking about the process versus the content. And this is a key piece of cultivating that sense of differentiation, that sense of self, to become aware of how it is that you interact with people. And, maybe you're looking for change, but I think, that doesn't have to happen right away. A lot of times I'll talk to people and they'll sort of like, I think, be a little hard on themselves and beat themselves up if they realize that they've been enacting a pattern that they want to stop, and sort of judge themselves for it. And I think that that's very natural. And before we can, so the unconscious mind is strong. A majority of our behavior comes from an unconscious part of ourselves. And the nature of that is that we cannot control it consciously. So the first step in creating change in your life is to become aware of what is happening. And sometimes we do that for a long time before we actually consciously change things. And I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but it's the awareness piece that actually creates the change a little bit over time. And this is why astrology is so cool, because astrology helps us to gain more insight and more awareness on what's happening, what has happened. And it helps us to peel back the literal and the more mundane phenomena in our life and in our psyche, and to look at symbolically what is happening. The symbolic is where the process is. And so you can do this through looking at your own birth chart And I highly encourage you to work with the birth chart of your family members as well, with consent, of course, to look for these patterns. So with yourself, you can look at where Pluto is in your birth chart. So I would definitely look at aspects that Pluto might be making to the inner planets. That's going to be a huge key as far as how this sense of power and differentiation and healing can happen for you. And then you can look at the patterns in your family system as well. If you're looking at your family members' charts, what are the aspects that seem to repeat from one person to the next, from one generation to the next? And you can even meditate on, let's say that you have a combination between Pluto and Mercury. You can meditate on this combination. Look at the symbols of Mercury, which are the mind and the thought process and the intellect, words and speech, and how that connects with Pluto, the power and the control. So with Mercury, Pluto, this is really about the voice and speaking and naming that which is hidden or that which is uncomfortable to talk about. In contrast, let's say Venus Pluto, that is more about the nature of intimacy and connection and power and control and autonomy, especially around feminine or female issues of the gender of femininity or the expression of femininity. Even sexuality. And so how do these symbols play out in your life? And if you don't like the way that's playing out, what are some other possibilities using and elaborating on the symbolism there? Another way to work into this is to use what we call the I position. So this is also a Bowen Family Systems term. This is about maintaining and focusing on your feelings, your needs, and your desires, and communicating from that place. Instead of trying to get someone to do something that you want. This is saying, hey, this is where I am, this is what I want. And it's like coming from a place of transparency, versus one of the problematic sides of Pluto is manipulation or control and trying to get someone to do something sort of without being totally upfront about it. We want to do the opposite of that. We want to say, hey, like, this is how I'm feeling. This is how I'm feeling when this happens. Super big focus on being objective. Like, hey, when this scenario happens from this objective scenario, I feel this. This is another part of the differentiated type of communication. Another way that I think about this is communicating in a way that comes from strength and power, that's also loving and responsive versus reactive. So saying like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I want. This is my preference. And, how do we, like, what should we do here? And coming into it in that loving, kind approach. And so I wonder how does this land with you? How does it sound to start to communicate this way? The last piece that I'll share with you here that's also really important is, again, a Bowen family systems term, is about detriangulation. So triangulation is when there's a disagreement between two people and they rope in a third person into that situation to essentially, it's a healthy coping mechanism for a system. It's essentially to relieve some of the anxiety. So it's not bad to do, and it leads to a problematic pattern when it's done over and over again within the same system. So like a classic example of this is two adults, let's say two parents are fighting and they bring their kid into that and start, let's say they have an argument or they're not getting along in their relationship just between the two of them. And then they start getting mad at their kid for, acting out and doing something, or the kid starts to act out. And then suddenly the problem is the kid and not the relationship between the two adults. But this can happen, even in friendships or in other parts of the family. And so this is also Plutonian in nature as well, because it's about that manipulative kind of, and again, it's not manipulative bad, it's just going about things that is not fully transparent. There's kind of like this secret kind of situation that's going on. It's secret to everyone because we're doing it unconsciously. And it's about redistributing the power in order to relieve some of that anxiety that's happening. So the way to do this in a way that that enhances connection and that reduces anxiety over the long term is for the two people that are having the conflict to actually talk to one another directly. And sometimes this is really difficult. So this again goes back to working with the I position and communicating to people what it is that you want and need, with transparency, with kindness and directness. I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a hard time saying exactly what I want in a way that is very direct. And I think that we can also see this in the chart too, in your birth chart. Happens very often if someone has a lot of planets in a water sign, especially their moon in a water sign, or maybe they have a lot of planets in the 12th, the 8th, or even the 4th. It can be a little bit difficult to ask for something directly. I would even say a person with a lot of planets in Libra or moon in Libra, I've noticed, it can be really difficult to be direct. That's just not the nature of it. And so these people that have these kinds of patterns, they're very good at being diplomatic and making sure that there's no emotional upset. And it's difficult when they need to actually communicate directly in order to get what they need. And it's helpful when we can say what we need, because usually people want to, they want to give you what you need, and they want to hear what's important to you. So I want you to keep that in mind. I hope this was helpful. I love hearing from you. I love comments and I love reviews. Please leave a review and let me know how this resonated with you. Or you can also contact me via my website, astropsyche.net. A reminder that I offer personal readings if you want to go deeper into some of these topics. So a reading with me is 60 minutes. It's recorded because it's a lot of information, so you can listen back later. We go into anything that you want in the reading: the future, the past, relationships, career. And we use the astrology to get into the struggles that you're having so that you can work through them. If you want to book a reading with me, you can go to my website, astropsyche.net. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sending you lots of love and wishing you many blessings in the days ahead. Bye for now.